Welcome to the Gary Wilkerson Podcast. So glad you're here with us today. We are going to be discussing a very important topic, one that's timely, one that really be essential to your life, to your thriving, to your joy. We're here with Pastor Tim Dilena, pastor of Times Square Church in New York City. We're going to be talking about how to thrive and how to maintain your joy and peace and confidence in the midst of times of crisis. What do you do when you're thrown into a difficult situation and you want to maintain your testimony, your joy, and your life? So we're happy to have Tim Dilena. Tim, thanks for joining us today. Happy to have you here.
Great. It's great to be here, Gary. Thank you.
And we've known each other. For those of you that don't know, Tim and I have known each other since we were little kids. Our dads knew each other. Why don't you start by telling us the story of our dads?
It's always a joy because we get to tell this story every time we travel together around the world. And what we tell people all the time is that we're second generation. Our dads, when David Wilkerson came to New York City, those who have listened, watched, or read The Cross and the Switchblade, there was a moment where your dad is preaching on the streets of Brooklyn, New York, and where the Mau Mau's, Nicky Cruz is out there, and a New York City policeman was trying to stop your dad from speaking. And then a New York City police captain comes up and says, "What's going on?" He says, "He's trying to preach here without an American flag." And my dad simply said, "Let the man preach." Yeah. And that was my dad. And then from that point on, not only a relationship between those two, my dad becoming the first treasurer of Teen Challenge, but we became friends. And so we're really following in their footsteps.
Yeah. Wow. And we've been friends for a while. We pastored together in Detroit and now you're pastoring at Times Square Church. We'll talk about that here just a little bit, but just a little sidebar comment. As you were saying that, your dad came up to my dad and said, as long as you have was it you have to have an American flag? Or
yeah, the one policeman said you have to have an American flag.
Okay, and now it'd probably be you can't have an American flag.
You're probably right.
You can't
Gary.
preach and you can't have an American flag. So you're breaking two laws. And thank God for faithful policemen like your father who loved Jesus and raised you guys up and your family in the things of the Lord.
And what was amazing, it was one of those moments where you just didn't violate, in a sense, the blue code. You didn't go against another police officer.
Right.
But when you're a Christian in that, you knew a higher law.
Yeah.
And to see your dad preach the gospel. And the fact of the matter is, I'm at Times Square Church today because my dad was there seeing your dad. And when he said, "Let the man preach," who knew that maybe 50 years later, he was even speaking about me.
Yeah, that's if you've read The Cross and Switchblade or seen the movie, that's the event, the outdoor event where Nicky first heard the gospel and where he first heard the words, "Jesus loves you," which haunted him for weeks to come. Finally, a few weeks later at a place called St. Nicholas Arena is where Nicky and his gang actually met Christ. So, so if that is the sovereignty of God and the timing of God is really phenomenal.
One of the joys, Gary, is over the years, from the time we were in Detroit, yourself and some of the others inspired me to build a library. And so over the years, some 20,000 books that God allowed me to put together in a library. We're sending it up to our Bible school, Summit International, that your dad started in Pennsylvania. And so we're going to put we're going to call it the Captain Paul Dilena Memorial Library, and the cornerstone's going to say, "Let the man preach."
Let the man preach. Oh, I love it. That's good news, man. I love it. Well, so after Detroit, you stayed on in Detroit, pastored for a while. Then you went down to Louisiana, and from there, you got a call from. So my dad founded Times Square Church. Then Pastor Carter Conlon became the pastor for like a decade or so, and then. So there was a transition. Pastor Carter was feeling like some things were changing. He told me a story about like even long before he'd ever invited you to come take over that very large church, very influential church, global really in its reach. And we'll talk more about that as well. But so tell me a little bit about the story of when he first started hinting. Was it a hint or was he
there was no hint.
Okay, yeah. Tell us about it.
Gary, I and it's always in these moments. I'm so grateful for you and Kelly and even your faith in me, because I'm in ministry today because of you guys inviting me after a 2-month missions trip to go with you and Kelly to Detroit and say, "Would you stay on?" And so when I was in Detroit, I ended up staying there for 30 years. So we were really 27, and we not only started church in the city together, but then we started another church in a XXX movie theater. And we were there for 20 years pastoring in this former XXX movie theater. On one side was a prostitution hotel. The other side was a strip club owned by a hustler. And then across the street was worldwide pornographic videos. And so we bought the flagship theater. And then almost 30 years in Detroit, 20 years at this church, we get a call that we were to go to Brooklyn. And so Jim Cymbala asked us to come aboard and help him at Brooklyn Tabernacle. So we just get to New York. And the first person I called after my wife was your dad, just to go, do you think this is right? He goes, God's prepared you for this moment. So I remember talking to your dad, then we went to Brooklyn. I was there 1 week and I reached out to Carter, and we've known each other at that point for probably 15 years. So he was welcoming to the city. We were talking about bringing the choirs together, maybe Madison Square Garden. And Carter tells me, this is the story he told me. He said, while we were sitting at this steakhouse, it was called Gallagher's on 52nd. He said, Tim, you kind of blurred on me. And he said, I heard the voice of the Lord. And he said two things to me. And Carter kind of looked at me and he says, I think I have a word of the Lord for you. And I was just saying, hey, I'm happy to be, I'm only here a week. And he goes, I can only tell you part one. So, and he's never done this, Gary, in our 15 years. So he says to me this, he said, the next 2 years are going to be the hardest years of your ministry. And it's not really the word that you want to hear. And the honest truth is I was pretty dismissive of it. I was going, sure, whatever. And
sorry for interrupting you, but after having worked with Gary Wilkerson, to have somebody say this is the hardest 2 years,
you're going to go like, you have no idea. You have no idea. And so when we get there, it was, and it was no fault of any person. It was God deepening a work in us. We love the Cymbalas, we love Brooklyn Tab, but there was a deepening work that God needed to do. And I always told Carter Conlon, I said, you really didn't tell me the truth. It wasn't 2, it was 5. But there was a work that God needed to do in us there. And he says, but I can't tell you the second word. And honestly, I really didn't want to hear the second word. If it was like the first one.
That's the good part. We don't hear the bad news now.
And then almost, I would say it was close. That was in 2010, almost 9 years later, Carter tells me, he says, it's time for me to give you the second word. And what was amazing was we sat in the same restaurant, and the waitress, after 9 years, sits us at the same table, and there was nobody in the restaurant, Gary. We were the first ones there. And he says, it's time for me to give you the second word. And I looked at him and said, if this is bad, I said, I'm leaving right now. And he looked at me and he said, God spoke to me, and he says, that man is your replacement. And he said, I don't know how it can come. I don't know how it can happen, is what Carter was really kind of conversing with God. And he just goes, what I did with that is I went back home that day, told my wife and 2 elders and said, judge this word in 2010 to see if this is going to, but Tim Dilena is not meant to be at Brooklyn Tab. He's meant to come here, be my successor. And that's what he told me 9 years later. And it was right, because there was, and he told me this, he said, I couldn't tell you the second part because it wouldn't have been profitable for you or for us to know that.
Yeah. So as I introduced the theme here today, sort of maintaining your joy and peace and confidence in the midst of a difficult time. So you had that 5-year period, and it turned out to be the most difficult, but yet, some of those are the most profitable times for our soul too. So that's probably one of the things we could say to those listening is when you're going through a hard time, there's a lot of profit to be gained in those hours.
And there is. And probably the thing, Gary, that brought me through those difficult times, I was reading through the book of Acts, and I have a Bible here that when you're reading the New Testament and you come across, for example, here in the New Testament, a passage and all the letters are in capitals, it's referring you back to the Old Testament. It's just a little gimmick that it just has in here. So it just reminds me, hey, they're quoting this.
What's it called? Sorry, just out of curiosity.
It was just from Thomas Nelson. It's a New American Standard Bible. And it's just one of the things that they do in their New American Standards. So I'm reading the very first prayer, and this is what got me through these 5 years. When you said like going through getting joy in the midst of this, I'm reading Acts 4, And the church has just been persecuted. They've been thrown into prison. In fact, it says all the apostles were thrown into prison. They come out and rejoicing that they were persecuted. And it's the very first prayer we have of the early church when you read Acts 4. And when you're reading it, I started to notice that all of the letters were in capital letters. I'm going, their prayer is from the Old Testament. So then I went back to it, and they were reading from the book of Psalms. They were quoting Psalms, and there was Psalms 2. They were quoting, though the heathens rage, and God will laugh in heaven. And I'm reading that prayer, and I'm going, wow. So they're praying Psalms in their worst time. And then it dawned on me. And there's Jesus on the cross quoting 3 different Psalms, that in his hardest time, he's praying the Psalms from the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Psalm 22. And he's starting to pray that. And then it really, like a sledgehammer, Gary, hit me. The worst place and the most Psalms, 7 different Psalms prayed, was in the worst condition you can ever be, the belly of the whale. That in Jonah chapter 2, Jonah prays, and you see 7 different locations of the Psalms. And all I realized at that point was, for almost 5 years, I read the Psalms, there was the Billy Graham plan, which you read 5 Psalms a day and get through it. Probably 3 to 5, 12 times a year, almost 3 to 4 years I did that and went through the Psalm probably close to 40 to 50 times. But God, I said, if he can take you through the cross, he can take you through persecution, and he can take you through the belly of a great fish, I think he could take me through my season. And it was praying the Psalms.
Yeah, I love that. The Psalms are challenging and encouraging all at the same time. It's spontaneous, because what you're going through in hard times is exactly what the Psalms are about. David's cry, he's constantly, if you're not careful, you'd almost think he's schizophrenic, because he's saying, Lord, why have you abandoned me? Do you hate me? Have I gone too far into my sin that you've rejected me forever? But I know you love me, and I'm so grateful for all the good things you've done for me, but my enemies are overwhelming. And I was like, okay, man, my head is spinning over this. It's a little bit of a hard book to preach expository sermons from, because it just moves so rapidly. And that's why but you can see, like you say, in the New Testament, they're pulling things out. So yeah, I say point 1 of this podcast is when you're going through a hard time or when trials hit you, to pray, maybe look at the Psalms as well.
Look at the Psalms. I literally, if I were to show you my phone, I have probably 60 or 70 Psalms in there that I would pray over every day. And it was as if a burden was being lifted. And it was because I think sometimes what it did for me, Gary, where I couldn't formulate the words to pray, I needed help. And God goes, I've given you the help. Just pray those. And that's what I did.
So that was a hard time. Then you came out of that, but sort of moved into another hard time. Let's talk a little bit about you got invited then to take the lead role at Times Square Church, and that was an interesting time in our country and in your city and in our life. So let's look into that a little bit. What was happening there at that time? Well,
you and me and Nikki Cruz were coming back from Budapest, and there was this talk that there is a virus and no one talked about global pandemic, any of those things.
And at this time, you knew you were eventually going to be taking the pastoral role at Times Square Church.
Yes, and and literally the week before we go to Budapest is when we announce it, and then I'm supposed to go to New York City 2 months later. So May 5th. And so when we get back from Budapest, I lost from traveling through Atlanta, Amsterdam, and through Paris to get there on those flights, and speaking to all those pastors, me, you, and Nikki. I come back and I was having trouble breathing. I lost my taste. And at that time, no one really knew any symptoms.
Right.
So my doctor said it's probably just your allergies. Not realizing
they didn't have it.
They didn't
codified at that point to know what it was.
And it was probably not long after that the world shut down. Yeah. Times Square Church then began to shut down right around March. And I'll never forget, I was supposed to be there at the very end of April, beginning of May is when I was supposed to go there. And I remember the words of Pastor Carter Conlon. He said this, he said, Tim, why don't you just wait until we reopen? He said that you don't want to come here, with the church shut down. He said, who knows, maybe a couple more weeks or a couple more months. And this is, I remember telling Pastor Carter, I said, I don't know if you saw the movie Gladiator. I said, but that opening scene, after Russell Crowe wins this excruciating battle, I said, the son of the emperor, Commodus, comes in with this white uniform. And all of a sudden he asks his father, he says, did I miss the battle? And his father goes, you missed the war. And I said, Carter, I said, I have to be there. I said, from the very beginning of this.
If you miss the battle, you miss the war.
That's exactly right. And so I said, if we come out of this and I come in on a white uniform, I said, I don't know what they've went through. And then when we got there, we didn't realize we were going to be shut down for 18 months in New York City. And not only, Gary, would you be inheriting a church, but also inherited a global pandemic. Then we had all the racial unrest that was taking place around the country and riots all over New York City. From our block on Broadway and 51st, every window of every store was broken out. There was sometimes I came out of a Sunday recording, a live service, and then a recording on a Sunday, walked out into 1,000-person protest right outside the doors of the church. Yeah. And so having to get back to an apartment. And then on top of that, then you had a volatile election that would begin to take place. And so all of those things put together, and that's when God goes, it's time to take the church.
Yeah, man. And so right in the middle, you're thrown right in the middle of the battle, which was a war. And it was, you mentioned Psalms and prayer for that 5-year time period. What helped maintain, like, you didn't come in and say, like, Lord, why did you call me here? Or why this timing? Or was it more like, this is good, something good's going to happen from this?
That's a great question, Gary, because even added to that, my children were finishing school. We didn't sell our house yet. So I was even commuting for 8 months. I would go through the airports and there would be in LaGuardia or JFK, 2 people in line at TSA. It was a ghost town, is when I came to New York City. Streets were empty. And there was a passage that helped me. It was in Jeremiah chapter 16, around verse 14, and it was one of the hardest times. They're in Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah is the prophet. And Gary, he says this to the children of Israel. He said, you've been telling 1,000-year story. He says, but I'm going to ask you not to tell the story anymore. He says, you've been telling about the deliverance of Egypt. And so you had the Moseses and the Joshuas and how to get out. He says, don't tell that story anymore. And then he says this, he says, the next story you're going to tell is how you've been delivered from the north, which was Babylon. And I felt like the Lord said to me, he said, you're going to be telling a new story. You're going to be telling a new story of what I've done. He said, we're so thankful for the legacy that your father, and not only coming to New York to start Teen Challenge, but also Times Square Church, to come at a time on Broadway when half of the theaters are shut down, when 8th Avenue was all full of pornographic theaters, all those things. I remember being when your dad started at the Nederlander, you were there, and I remember this is how bad New York was. When you guys were on 41st, they were giving the offering announcements. I heard it with my own ears, and it was your Uncle Don goes, thank you for coming. We're going to take our offering. Oh, we have one announcement. And many of us grew up in a church going, your lights are on. Your Uncle Don said, if you own a white BMW, they're taking the tires from your car right now. And really the New York of the 80s is really back. This is the New York we grew up in. And the homelessness and the pandemic has just so hurt it. But this is where God really spoke to me and said, I'm going to write a new story. That people aren't going to be baptized simply in a baptistry. They're going to be baptized in lakes. They're going to be baptized in showers and bathtubs. And for 18 months, we dedicated so many children online. We would do baptismal services virtual from all over the world. People are being baptized while the worship is going on in ponds, alleys of the Bronx, ponds in New Jersey, and lakes in Manila. And we saw God begin to start writing a new story saying, I'm going to do something different. So you don't have to tell those, we're excited what we did through Moses and Joshua. But if you remember the deliverance story of the North, God goes, I'm going to bring up new characters. You're going to see the Ezras and the Nehemiahs. I'm going to use women. You're going to see a story about a girl named Esther. I'll take 3 Hebrew children, and I'm going to show you how they can get through a fire. And Daniel, how a young man comes in and outlives 4 and becomes a prime minister, outlives 4 kings, and how you can do all this. And God goes, look for the Daniels, the Meshach, Shadrach, the Ezras, the Nehemiahs, and the Esthers, because I'm going to write a brand new script.
And that's right in the midst of all that turmoil going on. As you described, New York reverting back to its days of trash on the streets and prostitution and people selling drugs left and right everywhere you walk. And then you add on top of that, which we didn't really have in the 80s, was the rioting and the protests and of course on top of that COVID. So you have layer upon layer upon layer of trauma and difficulty, trials, and then your people, they're online, which helps, but they're not able to sort of rub shoulders with other believers in a category. So they come back to the church. You opened again not too long ago. What do you feel in the midst of, so you got racism, you got problems with poverty and crime. Crime is on the uptick, murders in the cities like that, Chicago and New York and others. What do you feel? Do you in the middle of that, do you just sort of, not just, but you just go like, this Sunday I think I want to preach on faith, or do you feel like this is a time to tackle certain issues, or where are you going just as a pastor in your messaging?
Well, I mean, there's so much there. If you spent the time of studying out each of those things I remember we had to go live with a message after the Capitol the building was coming. I mean, it's like everything was like New York was on edge on the results of the election. Like we had to board up probably 2 to 3 times. We had to board up our church windows because you just didn't know what was going to happen and how volatile the city has been. And you don't know what could take place. A riot or something could happen there. And here's what we have felt as you're facing with all of these things, from what took place with the police departments to the injustices, all of those things. There was an old preacher from Australia who said it like this. He says, if you want to show how crooked a stick is, lay down a straight stick. Just put down instead of yelling at the crooked sticks, put down a straight stick. And that's what we have felt to do. We said, let's take the position that we're going to lay down every week a straight stick and say, this is what God has called us to. Instead of preaching against those things. And I'm not saying that there's never a time to do that, but I think our time that we needed to do was to stay with the straight stick.
Would that be like, so let's take the issue of racism, for instance. Would that be, instead of saying like, here's the statistics on racism and here's why we're racist and here's how to avoid racism, instead you would just say, here's what love looks like, or here's how to live at peace with each other, or how would you tackle issues like that?
Which Gary, which is a great point. So this is what Paul says in Romans. And it's funny, he's going to start with those capital letters. He's going to go back to Exodus. He says, for you heard, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not commit a murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, it's summed up in this one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to its neighbor. So my choice is this. Do I say, don't be a racist? Don't treat people with inequality. Don't live with inequality. I can preach on all the don'ts, but here Paul says the best thing to do is to say, love your neighbor. If you love your neighbor, here's what's amazing. He says, you'll take care of adultery, murder, covetousness, and stealing if you put down the right stick. Because love, and then the next verse in Romans 13 says, love does no wrong to a neighbor. So if you're speaking about all the wrongs that are done, but you're not giving people that 30,000-foot view that says, love your neighbor. And I remember Cindy and I have been avid tennis fans and tennis players. And so I remember taking a lesson from someone who was on tour, and they gave me this kind of tweak on a backhand. And they said, if you turn your shoulder, if you show your shoulder blade to the ball coming, they said that turn will correct 4 different things. That instead of trying to correct the 4, where your arm is, where your head is, where your feet are, it was like, if you get the shoulder turn, 4 of the things get corrected. And I think what he's telling us is this. Yeah. You get to love your neighbor right, 4 things are corrected. So do you do a series on don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery, or do you do a series on love your neighbor?
Yeah, that's profound, man. That shows the sufficiency of the gospel,
that's
the
right.
Sufficiency of Scripture that is all contained there. Yeah. Otherwise, you alluded to the fact that to take every issue, crime or family life, and we can preach on those things as you said, but as we preach, we want to have a working knowledge of the situation we're talking about. So you would have to spend, days and days studying every issue that comes up, be it political or social or relational, family, financial, and the expectation is almost to be a therapist and a psychologist and a money counselor, and it's just we're pastors, and I know your people appreciate that. I know they're coming, and you had an amazing opening. I saw some of the video of your opening. That's just been, now it would be a couple months ago when this is aired here, and so it's how do you feel it's going now?
Yeah, because Gary, you still, and this, you face, because of where we face even political, there's a divide in the church today, whether it's on vaccines or on candidates. There's huge controversies. So do you tackle candidacies? Do you tackle all of these things? Here's all I know, straight stick, that we know. For example, 1 Timothy 2 says this: first of all, I urge you, for entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgiving, we beg you to have behalf on all men, for kings and all of those in authority, that you may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness, because this is good and acceptable to God. So I know this, that do you use a pulpit to go, don't vote, do this is what's wrong, or do you go, whoever's in authority, we are to pray for those people? And even when you get even to Peter's epistles, he's asking you to submit to authority. And at that time, it's Nero. It's one of the worst persecutors of the church. So to take, like you said, those answers are there. So when we do the reopening and we keep everything at the straight stick, that instead of being driven by what is the headline of the day, we're driven by what the Word of God says. And so the Word of God, and what's amazing is, like you said, the Word of God really does give those answers for us. And that's what we've done. So since we opened September 12th, and we chose it, one is because New York was really, it was, and we didn't even mention this during the taking of Times Square Church. It was also the epicenter of the pandemic in the U.S. More deaths, and when I got there, we were close to 34,000 deaths when I got there. So we opened up later. We opened up when Broadway opened up, which was the second week of September. And Gary, it has been incredible what we've seen God do. And we feel like, and our goal was this, that we have really told the church, we were so happy to open up the doors, but our goal wasn't just simply to open up 51st and Broadway. Our goal was to open up doors around the world digitally and through technology.
Yeah, and you did that. That's so the reach has been phenomenal.
It's been phenomenal.
Well, you're going to be back with us on the next episode. We're really glad to have you share your heart on making it through difficult times, and you've done it with a stellar attitude and heart and fruitfulness out of bearing fruit in season and out. So this was kind of an out season, but we've been able to continue to bear fruit. So thanks for being with us today, and join us next week. Next episode is Tim joins us again, and we're going to kind of continue this what we're talking about here today. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it.
You bet.
The Gary Wilkerson Podcast is brought to you by World Challenge, transforming lives through the message and mission of Jesus Christ. Each week, this podcast reaches thousands of listeners. This critical work is made possible by the generous contributions of individuals like you who believe in World Challenge's mission. Thank you for listening and supporting